The sun hung low over Dry Creek, turning the sky to rust and copper as the wind stirred dust across the empty trail. Caleb Morgan guided the delivery cart with quiet routine, the reins loose in his weathered hands, boots coated in a film of dry sand. The barrels rattled in the back, sloshing faintly with whiskey and beer, life's currency in a town that clung to habit harder than it clung to hope. His face bore the wear of a man who had seen too much and shared too little. The deep lines around his eyes weren't from age, but from long hours staring into silence. First the silence after his wife coughed her last breath, then the one that followed the burial of their only boy. That silence hadn't left him. It had only followed him here. Then he saw her. Half hidden behind a thicket of mesquite, crumpled near a dry arroyo, lay a girl, no more than 15. Her dark braid was matted with blood, her dress torn. Caleb pulled the reins hard. The cart jerked to a halt. He jumped down, boots thudding in the dust, and knelt beside her. "Nava," she whispered, before her eyes rolled back and her head slumped. Caleb glanced down the road. Dry Creek was still a mile out. He hesitated for a moment, long enough to hear the voice of his barback, Jeb, in his head. "Don't bring trouble to your doorstep, Caleb, not again. Not." But trouble had already found him, and this time she was a girl bleeding in the dirt. He lifted her gently, cradling her like he used to hold his son when nightmares woke the boy. She was light as a breath and burning with fever. By the time they reached town, dusk had settled. Caleb didn't go through the front. He guided the cart around to the back alley of the Copper Star, nudged the hidden side door open, and carried Nava up the stairs to the old storeroom above the saloon. He laid her on a cot, fetched water, and cleaned the wounds on her side and scalp. She stirred only once, eyes fluttering open just long enough to fix on his face, and then she slept again. Jeb found him an hour later, arms crossed at the door. "You've lost your mind," he muttered. "You know what Harrow will do if he finds out?" Caleb didn't answer. He just pulled the sheet higher over Nava's shoulder and whispered, "Let him come." That night, after locking the saloon and making sure Jeb was gone, Caleb lit a lantern and descended the narrow stairs into the basement. Past the barrels and crates, beyond the shelf of broken chairs and winter gear, there was a false wall of adobe brick. He slid it aside. Behind it, a small chamber opened into quiet darkness. Symbols carved into the earth glowed faintly when the lantern passed. He walked slowly, reverently to the center, where a small stone altar stood surrounded by bones, artifacts, and painted stones. The place had a pulse, a memory, a cost. He lit the 3 candles he'd always lit, one for luck, one for protection, and one for the silence that kept the past from rising. As he stood there, the flame on the center candle flickered violently, then went out. He froze. A sound like whispering leaves filled the chamber, though the air was still, and behind him, something moved. The next morning brought the kind of August heat that clung to your skin before you even stepped outside. Inside the Copper Star Saloon, Caleb stood behind the bar, polishing a glass he didn't need to polish, listening to the hum of town gossip slipping through the swinging doors. "Stagecoach was ambushed again," said old Tanner, settling into his usual stool. "Maybe them Apache are riled up," muttered another. Caleb's hands paused mid-polish. He glanced toward the ceiling above where Nava still slept, fever slowly breaking. "She don't look like Apache," Jeb whispered, sliding in beside him. "And that wound, it's no arrow." Caleb didn't respond. He didn't need to. They both knew that whoever hurt that girl wasn't riding in from the desert. He walked on 2 boots and had a badge pinned to his chest. Later that afternoon, Caleb brought up a bowl of broth. Nava was sitting upright now, wrapped in one of his late wife's shawls, her eyes scanning the room like a caged hawk. "You're safe here," he said gently. She didn't speak, but took the bowl with both hands. After a few sips, she murmured, "Why?" He shrugged. "Because someone once helped me when I didn't deserve it. Maybe now it's my turn." Nava looked at him then, not with trust, not yet, but with something close to recognition. That night, as the town turned in and the Copper Star emptied out, Caleb sat by the fireplace downstairs, listening to the crackle of flame and the distant rustle beneath his feet. He knew the chamber below was changing. The altar had never gone dark before. Something had shifted since Nava arrived. He didn't sleep. The next morning, Sheriff Tom Harrow rode up with 2 deputies, dust curling off their horses like warning smoke. Caleb stepped outside before they reached the porch. "Morning, Morgan," Harrow said, pulling off his gloves. "Heard someone saw you hauling something heavy off the trail 2 nights ago. You see anything out there?" Caleb met his eyes. "Just dust and buzzards." Harrow grinned. "You sure?" "Rumor says an Indian girl went missing from the Stewart Ranch. Help was whipped good, claims he saw her running. Now we got folks saying she might be here. Rumors aren't law." Caleb replied flatly. The sheriff leaned in. Neither is hiding fugitives. Caleb's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed steady. You've got no cause. Search warrant, you can come on in. Until then, you'll have to drink your coffee somewhere else. The standoff hung in the air like smoke. Then Harrow laughed. You always were a stubborn one. He turned and mounted up, leaving a swirl of dust behind. But as they rode off, Caleb caught one of the deputies looking up at the saloon window, the one where the curtain had shifted a moment too late. Back inside, Caleb shut the door and bolted it. Nava stood on the stairs, hand gripping the railing. He's not done, she said quietly. I know, Caleb replied. She walked down slowly, eyes scanning the saloon walls filled with relics and antlers and old guns. Then her gaze shifted toward the floor, toward the boards that creaked over the chamber below. You opened something that should have stayed closed, she whispered. Caleb swallowed hard. I didn't mean to. Nava looked at him for a long moment. The earth remembers. And then, behind them, a glass fell from the shelf, with no hand to push it. It shattered on the floor. Neither of them moved. By midday, the copper star felt colder than the windless air outside. Caleb stood behind the bar, mechanically stacking clean glasses, his thoughts tangled with Nava's warning. The earth remembers. The past did remember, and now it was whispering back. Business had already begun to slow. Townsfolk who once played cards at his tables and downed whiskey to his toasts were now avoiding the place altogether. Caleb could see it in the eyes of those who passed by, looking at his saloon like it was cursed or worse, contaminated. That afternoon, Margaret Wells stepped through the doors, her boots tapping softly on the floorboards. She was dressed in her school clothes, dusty blue cotton and a straw hat pushed back. Caleb hadn't seen her in over a year, not since she left flowers on the grave of his wife. You heard the whispers, I suppose, Caleb said as he poured water for her, not meeting her gaze. I did. I also heard Harrow was sniffing around your back door. Her tone was quiet but steady. Caleb looked up. Margaret's gaze was level but not unkind. She had always seen through things and through him. There's a girl upstairs, he said finally. Hurt. Native. I couldn't just leave her out there to die. You know what that'll cost you, right? He nodded. Already is. Margaret sipped the water. She's safe? As safe as she can be in a town like this. Margaret leaned closer. Then I'll keep my mouth shut. Caleb's throat tightened. He gave a small nod. In a world that had shrunk to whispers and shadows, her words felt like the first lantern in a long tunnel. That evening, the saloon was empty save for Jeb and a few regulars who left early. Caleb climbed the stairs with a tray of food, only to find Nava standing barefoot near the window, staring out into the dusk. They'll come again, she said. I know. I can feel them digging. He paused. Who? Your people. Beneath. They want what sleeps there. They always have. She turned to face him fully, and it knows the altar, the bones, They've been waiting. Caleb's breath caught. He didn't ask how she knew about the bones. That night he returned to the chamber with a lantern. The air felt heavier, charged. When he reached the altar, he noticed a thin crack in the stone slab. It hadn't been there before. Something was stirring. He placed one hand on the altar. I didn't mean to profane you, he thought, but the silence that followed wasn't forgiving. The next morning, Caleb was woken by Jeb pounding on the door. You'd best come quick. Harrow's outside again. He brought more men. Caleb dressed and went down. Through the swinging doors, he could see the sheriff, now with 5 deputies and a man in a brown vest bearing the silver pin of the local land syndicate. The crowd behind them had doubled. Dry Creek had come to watch. Harrow stepped forward. This is your last chance, Morgan. Hand her over, or we'll come in and find her ourselves. Caleb didn't flinch. You want to search my property, you'll need a warrant, signed by a judge. Until then, you're just a man in a hat making noise. A murmur ran through the crowd. Harrow's eyes darkened. You're protecting a fugitive. That makes you an outlaw. Caleb stepped out onto the saloon's porch, hands at his sides. His voice was clear. Then call me what you will. The crowd was silent. Then someone, Margaret, stepped forward and stood beside Caleb. One by one, others joined her. But from the back of the group, a man in the syndicate vest leaned close to Harrow. Let it be for now, he said. We'll get the land another way. As they turned and retreated, Caleb stood tall, but the weight on his chest grew heavier. That night, Nava stood at the edge of the cellar stairs. It's starting, she said, and beneath their feet, something moved again. Dry Creek had always been a quiet town, but now its silence felt tense like a wire pulled too tight. The kind of silence that followed a bad decision, or preceded a worse one. Inside the Copper Star Saloon, Caleb scrubbed the bar with more force than necessary. His hands worked automatically, but his mind replayed the moment from the day before. Harrow's threats, the eyes of the crowd, and the unexpected solidarity of Margaret and a few brave townsfolk. That moment had held weight, but Caleb knew the kind of men they were dealing with. They didn't retreat. They regrouped. Nava sat at the window of the upstairs room, watching the main road like it was a battlefield. Her hair had been washed. The bruises on her face had faded, but her eyes had aged beyond her years. Caleb brought her breakfast, setting it down without a word. "I had another dream," she said softly, still watching the horizon. "Same one?" She nodded. "A tree without leaves, roots reaching into the bones, and a song beneath the earth, like it's waiting to be finished." Caleb didn't respond right away. Dreams, he knew, weren't always dreams. Not in a place like Dry Creek, and certainly not when there was a burial ground under your feet. He finally sat across from her. "I didn't know what I found when we started digging. We were just trying to put in a new cellar. One of the workers, Emmett, found a stone covered in symbols. I wanted to stop, but the others, especially the foreman, they said it was nothing." She looked at him. "You didn't stop them." "I didn't," Caleb admitted, his voice low. "And when they quit, afraid of what they found, I kept going." He ran a hand over his face. "I told myself it was just superstition. But the truth, I wanted the saloon to succeed so badly I didn't care where the luck came from. I left the altar there, untouched. I even started lighting candles. It worked. People came. I made money." Nava's gaze didn't soften. "You fed your life with the death of my people." Caleb didn't look away. "I know." A long silence followed, until she finally said, "It's not too late, but the land is angry now. The more they dig, the more it wakes." That afternoon, Caleb decided to go into town. Not for supplies, but for answers. He stopped by Margaret's schoolhouse just as the children were leaving. She stepped out onto the porch with that same calm presence that had steadied him a dozen times before. "You heard anything?" he asked. Margaret nodded. "The syndicate's planning something. I overheard one of their men talking at the general store. They've petitioned the county for access to survey land under your bar. They think there's silver down there." "There isn't," Caleb said. "Only bones." "They don't care," she replied. "Silver talks louder than ghosts." They walked for a while in silence, down the dusty main road, past closed shops and suspicious glances. The town wasn't sure what side to be on anymore. Some wanted Caleb run out. Others were beginning to question the stories being spread. That night, back at the saloon, the temperature dropped suddenly. The air thickened, and a low hum vibrated the floorboards. Caleb lit a lantern and descended into the cellar. The crack in the altar had widened. Faint blue light pulsed from within. He reached out, but a sudden gust of cold wind blew out the flame. The cellar plunged into darkness. Then came a sound, soft, rhythmic, like drumming from far away. Caleb stood frozen, not with fear, but with the knowledge that something was building, something vast and ancient, pushed too far for too long. He climbed the stairs slowly, every step echoing louder than it should. Upstairs, Nava was waiting at the top. "They've begun digging on the other side of town," she said. "They think they're close." Caleb swallowed hard. "Close to what?" She didn't answer. Instead, she whispered, "Tomorrow we need to do a ritual, not to fix it, to ask the land for time." He nodded. "Whatever it takes." As the saloon darkened and wind howled outside, Caleb looked around the place he'd built from grief. Once it had been a shelter, then a shrine. Now it felt like a test, and beneath his feet, the earth pulsed like a beating heart, slow, steady, and watching. The next morning brought with it an eerie stillness, as though even the wind dared not move. The sun rose pale and hazy, casting a sickly light over Dry Creek. Caleb stood at the threshold of the saloon, watching dust swirl in uneasy spirals down the empty main road. Something had shifted in the town, and not just in the earth. Nava stood beside him, barefoot on the wooden porch, a strip of red cloth tied around her wrist. "We don't have much time," she said. "Once the land starts listening, it doesn't stop." Caleb didn't fully understand, but he didn't need to. He nodded and followed her into the cellar. The air beneath the copper star was different now, thicker, older. The crack in the altar had widened, glowing with a steady blue light that pulsed in rhythm with the faint drumming sound that never seemed to stop. Caleb had tried to block it out the night before, but it followed him even in sleep. Nava knelt in front of the altar. She arranged stones from a small cloth pouch in a tight circle, then placed her hand on the center crack. Her lips moved in a language Caleb didn't understand. Her voice trembled, but her hand did not. He stayed back, watching. It didn't feel like a ritual. It felt like a conversation, one held in the space between breath and silence, one where he was the intruder. When she was finished, she looked up. Her face was pale. "It's listening, but it's not calm. What do we do?" he asked. "We wait," she said, "and we prepare." But Caleb wouldn't have to wait long. That afternoon, the first sign came. Jeb burst through the saloon doors, out of breath and covered in dirt. "They tried to burn you out," he gasped. "Down by the stables. Someone set fire to your delivery cart. Nearly caught the back wall." Caleb rushed outside to find a charred, smoldering mess where the cart used to be. Flames had licked the edge of the building, but hadn't taken hold. Nava stood beside him silently, her eyes on the ground. Then came the second sign, a letter, hand-delivered by a courier who refused to look Caleb in the eye. It was a notice of eminent domain, signed and stamped by the county office. The land under the copper star had been marked for exploration. Effective immediately, Caleb crushed the letter in his hand. His fingers trembled, not with fear, but with something older, anger, guilt, a bone-deep determination that refused to rot. Inside, he found Margaret waiting. "I heard," she said. "The fire, the letter, they're coming for everything." Caleb nodded. "And I let them years ago." "You can't change what you did," she said gently. "But you can choose what you do now." He looked at her, really looked. The way her eyes held sadness without judgment. The way her voice didn't flinch when he confessed. "I lit candles over their bones. I asked for luck and I got it. I thought I could live with that." Margaret didn't say anything right away. Then, softly, "So did I. Every time I looked away. Every time I stayed quiet." The silence that followed felt less like shame and more like truth. That night, townsfolk gathered outside the Copper Star. Not all of them came to threaten. Some, quiet, cautious, came to help. A carpenter named Will offered new wood to replace the scorched siding. A schoolboy brought fresh water. Margaret stayed, sitting at the bar beside Caleb, helping sort letters and ledgers. But as the night deepened, the tension grew. From the alley, a rock smashed through the window. Shouts followed. Caleb rushed to the door. He saw 5 men, faces hidden in shadows, hurling torches toward the building. One caught on the edge of the roof. Flames licked upward. He ran for water, Nava and Margaret close behind. They doused it quickly, but the damage was done. The message was clear. "They want me gone," Caleb said, breathless. "They want the land," Margaret corrected. "You're just standing on it." That night, Caleb stood alone at the cellar entrance. He lit the 3 candles again, but this time he didn't ask for luck. He whispered, "I'm still here." The blue light in the crack flickered once, then flared, and above the wind began to howl. Morning brought no peace to Dry Creek, only wind, dust, and an unease that settled in the bones. Caleb stepped outside the saloon and saw it immediately. The sign painted across the side wall in crude, red letters. "Get out, sympathizer." He stared at it, jaw clenched. The message wasn't just for him. It was for anyone who had stood by him, anyone who dared to believe the girl upstairs deserved protection. The slow unraveling of the town had begun. Inside, Nava watched from the second-story window. She said nothing, but her eyes narrowed with calm, ancestral certainty, the same look his wife used to wear before a storm rolled in. By noon, Caleb noticed a change. The deliveries stopped. Barrels of whiskey and sacks of flour that were due that morning never came. When he walked down to the general store, the clerk refused to meet his eye. "Can't risk the sheriff's wrath," the man muttered. "Got mouths to feed, you understand." The door shut on Caleb's words before he could speak them. He returned to the saloon empty-handed. Margaret was there, already scrubbing the floor. "They're trying to starve you out," she said. He nodded. "Not just me. Anyone who sides with me." Jeb came in a short while later, slower than usual, hat in hand. "I need to say something," he began, eyes down. "I've been thinking about quitting, not because I don't believe you, but I've got a wife, a baby, and if Harrow's boys torch this place, I can't lose them too." Caleb nodded slowly. "I understand." Jeb swallowed hard. "I wish I was braver." "You're just trying to protect your family," Caleb said. "That's all I'm trying to do too." That afternoon, Margaret helped nail boards over the broken window. As they worked, townsfolk passed by on the road, some pausing to watch, others whispering, and a few just staring in silence. No one offered help, except for one. A farmer named Saul Gentry, long known for keeping to himself, walked up with a sack of potatoes and said, "It ain't much, but it's food." He left without another word. That night, Caleb returned to the cellar. The blue glow was stronger now, more rhythmic, almost alive. He didn't dare touch the altar. He only stood and listened. Somewhere deep beneath the ground, the drumming had returned. When he came back upstairs, Nava was waiting. "They're coming tonight," she said. "Who?" "The ones who don't want to wait for the law." Margaret stood nearby, pale but composed. "We should leave. There's still time." But Caleb shook his head. "If we leave, they win. If we stay, we protect more than just this place." Silence stretched between them. Then Nava stepped toward him. "The earth is angry, but it hasn't turned away from you yet. It's waiting for what you choose next. Margaret glanced between them, then picked up a lantern. Then we wait with you. It was near midnight when they heard it. Boots on gravel, wood creaking, whispers in the dark. Caleb stood behind the bar with a shotgun he hadn't used in years. Margaret held a poker. Nava stood near the staircase, one hand on the rail, the other clutching a small cloth bundle, her sacred stones. 3 shadows emerged from the alley, faces masked with bandanas. One hurled a bottle of kerosene. It smashed against the porch. Another reached for a match. Before he could light it, a wind screamed down the street, unnatural, sharp, howling like voices on the edge of grief. The men stumbled back, eyes wide, as the earth beneath the saloon gave a sudden, violent shudder. Windows rattled. The floorboards groaned. From below, a faint pulse of light bled up through the floor. The attackers fled. Caleb stood still, breath heavy, the shotgun still in his hands. Nava whispered, "The land is warning them." Margaret looked toward the cellar door. "What happens when it stops warning?" No one answered. By sunrise, the copper star stood quiet but not untouched. The tremor had left fine cracks along the walls, and the floor near the cellar stairs now sagged slightly, as if the building itself were bowing to something beneath. Caleb inspected the damage with methodical calm, his fingers tracing along the fissures like a man reading the fault lines of his own soul. Outside, Dry Creek buzzed with rumors. Some swore the saloon was cursed, others whispered about ghosts or Indian spirits or worse, but a few, just a few, walked past without spitting or glaring. A mother sent her son to deliver eggs. An old rancher tipped his hat without a word. Something was shifting. Still, the danger hadn't passed. The syndicate hadn't backed down, and Caleb knew Harrow wasn't finished. Inside the bar, Nava laid out her stones in careful, silent circles. She worked with the precision of a healer and the reverence of a priest. Caleb watched from across the room, holding back questions. He didn't want to disturb whatever force she was trying to reach, or whatever might reach back. Margaret arrived just after noon, her sleeves rolled and her hair tied back. "You've got people talking," she said with a tired smile. "Half the town thinks you've gone mad. The other half matter, they're not sure what to believe anymore." Caleb poured her tea. "That's a start." She leaned on the counter watching Nava. She said, "It's time for a ritual, a real one. Not candles, not whispered apologies, a calling." Caleb hesitated. "I don't know if I have the right to ask for anything down there." "Maybe you don't," Margaret replied. "But maybe it's not about asking. Maybe it's about listening." That night, the 3 of them gathered in the cellar. Caleb lit the lantern. Margaret brought salt. Nava carried a bundle of sage, feathers, and carved stones wrapped in red cloth. The altar's crack now glowed brighter than ever, pulsing like a heartbeat. The air was thick, but not choking. Heavy, yes, but expectant. Nava began to chant. The words rolled off her tongue like water over stone. Ancient syllables that didn't belong to this century, this saloon, or to Caleb's world. Yet they filled the space with meaning. Caleb sat cross-legged on the floor, legged on, eyes closed. At first he tried to keep his thoughts still, but memories crept in. He saw his wife's pale face the night she passed. He saw the tiny coffin lowered into dry earth. He saw his own reflection in the saloon mirror the day he found the stone beneath the cellar and chose not to walk away. Then something changed. The air grew colder, not cruel but clean, sharp, clarifying. And then he saw them, not ghosts, not specters, but memories shaped into light. His wife standing near the altar, her hands cupped over her heart. His son, smaller than he remembered, laughing softly, surrounded by warmth. Caleb wept, not with fear but with release. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Not to the altar, not to the spirits, but to them. I tried to bury it all, the grief, the guilt. I made this place into a shrine for forgetting." The vision didn't speak, but it didn't turn away either. When Caleb opened his eyes, the room was silent again. Nava stood, arms lowered. Margaret wiped her eyes. The altar no longer pulsed. The crack was still there, but it glowed with a soft, steady blue, as if it had stopped warning and had started waiting. Upstairs, the saloon creaked. Outside, distant thunder rumbled, though the sky was clear. And deep in the floorboards, Caleb felt something else, not anger, but patience, watching, forgiveness perhaps still out of reach, but not impossible. The wind returned the next morning, not as a whisper this time, but as a constant low howl that curled through the streets of Dry Creek, like a warning. Caleb stood outside the Copper Star, arms crossed, watching a group of men in long coats and shiny boots hammering stakes into the earth across the street. Surveyors. The syndicate had arrived in force, Their wagons bore the crest of the Silver Rock Mining Company, and their foreman barked orders like he owned the land already. They didn't even glance at the saloon. That made Caleb nervous. Arrogance was often the first step before a takeover. Back inside, Nava pored over an old book she had found hidden beneath one of the cellar's shelves. It was fragile, handwritten, pages full of tribal records, burial maps, and drawings that blurred the line between history and prophecy. "They don't know what they're digging into," she said quietly, "but they will." Margaret was at the school trying to calm parents who feared their children might be caught in the middle of a spiritual war. Rumors had reached even the smallest corners of the town. Some claimed Caleb had conjured ghosts. Others said he'd been cursed, but a handful of voices, faint but growing, defended him. The pastor had even stopped by that morning. "I don't know what's under this saloon, Caleb," he'd said, "but I believe in penance, and I see a man who's finally living like he means it." It was the closest thing to grace Caleb had received in years. That afternoon, Jeb returned, hat in hand again. "I shouldn't have left," he said. "They came by the house last night. Men from the syndicate. Said they could offer me protection if I testified that you were harboring an outlaw." Caleb looked at him evenly. "And?" "I told them I'd rather be poor and honest than rich and used." He cleared his throat. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I came to help if you'll have me." Caleb nodded once. "Then stay." As twilight fell, Nava led Caleb and Margaret into the cellar again. This time, she didn't speak. She simply placed her hand on the altar and waited. The glow from the crack had faded into a slow pulse, no longer a warning, but not yet peace. Then Nava reached into the book and pulled out a folded paper, one Caleb hadn't seen before. It was a map, drawn with strange ink. It showed Dry Creek, and beneath it, a spiderweb of tunnels. At the center was the copper star. Caleb traced the lines with his finger. "This isn't just a burial site. It was a center," Nava said. "A place of gathering, of memory, and when they built over it, they sealed something beneath." He felt the truth in her words, not with logic, but in his bones. Later that night, Caleb found himself alone in the saloon, sipping lukewarm coffee and staring at the survey stakes outside. He didn't hear the footsteps until they were close. Her stranger sat across from him, tall, clean-shaven, wearing the syndicate badge on his lapel. "Mr. Morgan," he said smoothly. "I'm Alan Pierce. I oversee land acquisitions for Silver Rock." Caleb nodded once. Pierce placed a folded letter on the table. "This is an offer. More money than you've seen in 10 lifetimes. Enough to rebuild somewhere quiet, peaceful. All you have to do is sign and leave, tonight." Caleb didn't touch the letter. "And what happens to this land?" "Progress," Pierce said with a smile. "Silver, railroads, the future." Caleb studied him, then leaned forward. "There are bones under this saloon. Sacred ones. You tear into this ground, you're not just taking earth, you're stirring something that doesn't belong to you." Pierce stood slowly. "I don't believe in ghosts, Mr. Morgan." Caleb's voice was low. "You will." Pierce left without another word. The wind outside died suddenly. Inside the cellar, the glow brightened. And deep in the earth beneath Dry Creek, something shifted, something old, something waiting. The storm hit without warning. Dry Creek had known windstorms, dust storms, even lightning storms that danced over the mesa like spirits with sparks in their heels. But this was different. This storm rose from the ground, not the sky. It howled through alleyways and saloon doors like a voice screaming to be heard. Inside the copper star, Caleb stood frozen, shotgun in hand, as glass shattered from the windows and the floorboards trembled under his boots. The lanterns flickered wildly, then died one by one, snuffed by invisible hands. Nava stood in the center of the saloon, eyes closed, arms outstretched, whispering words in a language that belonged to a time long buried. Margaret was by the cellar door, clutching the banister, her knuckles white. Outside, angry voices rose through the wind. The syndicate had returned, not with letters but with men, armed, determined. They thought this was about land, about mining rights, about profit. They were wrong. Caleb burst through the saloon doors and into chaos. A group of men stood at the edge of the street, lanterns in one hand, rifles in the other. Alan Pierce shouted over the wind, "Stand down, Morgan, this is your last chance." "I already made my choice," Caleb shouted back, his voice carried by something stronger than lungs. Behind him, others stepped forward. Margaret, Jeb, Saul Gentry, and even the pastor. No one held a weapon, they just stood beside Caleb, shoulder to shoulder. Pierce's men hesitated. Then a deputy loyal to Harrow shoved forward and threw a torch. It landed on the porch, igniting dry boards in a burst of flame. Caleb turned to run. Then the ground moved. Not a tremor, a rupture. The street cracked open with a thunderous roar. A deep, Pulsing light surged up from beneath the copper star's foundations. It spread outward in jagged lines, splitting earth, stone, and certainty. Horses screamed. Men stumbled backward. From within the saloon, the altar, long dormant, flared to life. Down in the cellar, Nava stood before it, her chant now a full-throated call. The blue light poured from the crack in the altar like smoke and fire combined, reaching toward the ceiling, humming with raw, ancient power. Then the floor gave way. It didn't collapse. It opened. A perfect circle beneath the saloon sank downward, revealing a vast chamber beneath. The ceiling stretched into blackness, the walls carved with markings that no one alive could read, but everyone could feel. Caleb scrambled down into the new space, helping Nava stay steady. The ground was humming, alive, but not angry, not anymore. It had awakened. Above, the attackers scattered, their courage shattered by the earth's defiance. One by one, they dropped weapons and ran, some screaming, some silent, all humbled. Alan Pierce remained frozen, staring into the chamber from the edge of the broken saloon. "What is this?" he breathed. Caleb turned to him. "This," he said, voice hoarse, "is memory, and you can't mine memory." Pierce backed away. The storm began to quiet. The wind softened. The earth stilled, and for the first time in years, Dry Creek stood silent, not from fear, but from awe. Later that night, the survivors gathered in the saloon's shell. Margaret handed out blankets. Saul poured water. The pastor said nothing, only sat near the new chamber. Head bowed. Caleb looked down at the altar, its crack now whole, sealed by light. Nava stood beside him, her voice tired but steady. "It's not over, but it's listening now." Caleb nodded. He didn't need forgiveness. Not yet, but he'd earned a chance to ask for it. The next morning, Dry Creek awoke to a strange quiet, the kind that settles over a battlefield after the weapons are dropped and the shouting has stopped. Smoke still curled from the charred edges of the copper star, and splinters littered the street where the ground had cracked open like a wound, but there was no more screaming, no more threats, only silence. Caleb stood on what remained of the saloon's porch, staring out at a town too afraid to move. The syndicate's men had vanished overnight. Even Sheriff Harrow had disappeared, leaving behind only his hat and a half-empty bottle outside the jailhouse. But the real change was in the people. By noon, the townsfolk began to return, not with pitchforks or torches, but with hammers, buckets, and ropes. Silent apologies took the shape of work. Saul Gentry brought lumber. Jeb returned with nails and his son. Even the general store clerk came by with a crate of canned peaches and a muttered, "Figured you'd need this more than I do." Caleb nodded. He didn't smile, not yet, but something in his chest loosened, just a bit. Margaret joined him mid-afternoon, her sleeves rolled and hands already smeared with dirt and ash. She didn't speak at first, just stood beside him as they watched a group of children playing at the edge of the street, drawing shapes in the dust where the crack had once been. "I think they're less afraid than the rest of us," she said finally. Caleb gave a dry chuckle. "They don't know yet what we've done to deserve fear. But maybe," she replied, "they'll grow up doing better." Later, Nava appeared with 2 elders from a nearby tribe. Their arrival was wordless, solemn, sacred. One was a woman with hair as white as bone, the other a man whose face looked carved from sandstone. They stepped into the saloon without hesitation and stood at the edge of the now exposed chamber beneath, looking down in reverence. "This was not meant to be opened," the old woman said softly, "but now that it is, it must be healed." Nava bowed her head. "Will you help?" The elders nodded. A council formed that evening. Not in the sheriff's office, not in the church, but in the heart of the broken saloon. Caleb sat among them, not leading but listening. They spoke of the burial ground, the stolen artifacts, the bones that had become bricks in someone else's foundation. They spoke of sacred places turned into basements, and of the voices beneath the soil that were never meant to be silenced. When his turn came, Caleb stood. He didn't make a speech. He only said, "I can't undo what I did. I desecrated what should have been protected, and I used it. For money, for pride, for the illusion of purpose." He looked around the circle. "But I'm not leaving, not until it's made right." The silence that followed wasn't tense, it was full. The old man spoke then. "There is one final act before the earth can be settled. A rite, a confession, not just of guilt, but of intent." He turned to Nava. "He must go before the spirits, not to beg, but to remember." Nava looked to Caleb. He nodded. The ceremony was to take place the next evening. Until then, the townsfolk worked through the twilight hours, rebuilding what they could, sweeping out soot, setting up chairs in a circle around the glowing opening in the saloon floor. It wasn't just a hole anymore, it was an altar. That night, as the stars emerged one by one over Dry Creek, Caleb sat outside alone. Margaret joined him quietly. "You ready?" she asked. "No," he replied. "But I think that's the point." She reached over and took his hand. It was the first time someone had touched him like that in years, and for the first time in even longer, Caleb didn't feel like he was trying to hold on to something. He felt held. Dusk fell like a curtain over Dry Creek, blanketing the town in a hush that wasn't fear, but reverence. Lanterns glowed softly in every window, casting gold halos into the dusty street as townsfolk made their way one by one toward the Copper Star. They came not as customers or gossips or strangers, they came as witnesses. Inside the saloon, chairs had been arranged in a wide circle around the open chamber. The boards around the opening had been carefully reinforced, ringed with woven blankets and offerings, bundles of sage, carved stones, strands of corn, and handwritten prayers. It looked nothing like a courtroom, but it felt like one. Caleb stood just beyond the circle, dressed in a clean white shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows. He looked like a man walking to the gallows, but his step was steady. He wasn't here to defend himself. He was here to remember. Nava stood across from him, eyes reflecting the altar's soft glow. The two tribal elders stood at either side of the chamber, arms folded, silent as statues. When all were seated, the old woman stepped forward. "This land remembers," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It remembers the drums, the dances the children buried before they could speak. It remembers the hands that built and the hands that took. Tonight, we listen, and we restore." She nodded to Caleb. He stepped forward and faced the circle. "I was a husband," he began, "and then I wasn't. I was a father, and then I wasn't. And then I came to Dry Creek not to start again, but to forget everything I lost." His voice was even but not cold. "I found a stone buried in the earth beneath this saloon. It was sacred. I knew it the moment I saw it, and I told myself it was luck. I told myself it was just rock and dirt and coincidence. But it wasn't." He turned to face the elders. "I took what wasn't mine. I built my life on bones I didn't bury. I prospered off the silence of the dead. No one moved. Even the wind seemed to still. I lit candles not to honor, but to bargain. I wanted success without cost. And when the town called me honest, I said nothing. When they called me blessed, I said nothing. When they whispered about spirits, I said nothing." His voice cracked then, and he looked down. "But I knew. I always knew." A long silence followed. The fire in the chamber burned low and blue. Then Nava stepped forward, holding out a bowl filled with water drawn from a well on sacred land. She offered it to Caleb. "Purification," she said. He dipped his hands into the water, then touched his forehead, his chest, his hands. With each movement, his breath steadied. With each gesture, something in him loosened. The old man spoke at last. "You cannot change the past, but you have remembered it, and you have chosen to remain." He looked around the room. "And now Dry Creek must choose too." Margaret rose first. She walked to Caleb and placed a hand on his shoulder, then Jeb, then Saul, then the pastor. One by one, townsfolk stepped forward, not to absolve but to stand beside him. The old woman lifted her hands. "In the eyes of the land there is no perfect man, only those who listen and those who bury." She turned to Nava. "The chamber will be sealed tomorrow, not to hide it, but to protect it." Nava nodded. "The spirits are calm, but they are watching." That night, Caleb stood at the saloon's porch, watching the stars. He didn't feel clean, but he felt seen. Margaret joined him, silent for a long while. "Do you still hear them?" she asked. He nodded. "Not like before, but I hear something else." "What?" He looked at her, then at the town he had once tried to hide from. Possibility. The morning sun rose slowly over Dry Creek, painting the sky in soft orange and pink, the kind of quiet dawn that feels like an answer. Where once the Copper Star Saloon stood as a symbol of pride, secrecy, and shame, now it stood as something entirely different. It stood as a threshold. Work began early. The cellar chamber, still aglow with a faint, steady light, was sealed with reverence, not with concrete or nails, but with prayer and purpose. The elders led the ritual, Nava by their side, her chants echoing softly through the open doors of the saloon. No one spoke, unless asked. Townsfolk formed a line outside, bringing offerings, woven cloth, food, flowers, and tokens from family homes. One child placed a carved wooden horse near the edge of the chamber and whispered, "So you're not lonely." Caleb helped lower the final stones, each one marked with symbols painted in white clay. With each motion, he felt a piece of himself being placed, not to be buried, but to belong. By midday, the chamber was closed and the rebuilding began. The Copper Star's structure remained intact, but its heart had changed. The bar was shortened to make room for a communal space. Tables were rearranged for gatherings, not gambling. One wall was turned into a memory altar. Photographs, drawings and names of those lost, both from the town and the forgotten graves below. Caleb kept nothing of his former success. No trophies, no ledgers, no stories of luck. What remained was only what mattered: the truth, the people, and the purpose. Nava chose to stay, not as a guest, not as someone under protection, but as a leader. She and the tribal elders began using the space for storytelling, language classes, and gatherings that brought people of different bloodlines to the same fire. Margaret continued teaching, but her afternoons were often spent at the Copper Star. She and Caleb walked the streets together now, not as gossip, but as quiet proof of something earned: trust, love, a kind that grew slowly and held strong. Jeb returned full-time. His son played behind the bar, chasing dust motes in the sunlight. The townsfolk who once avoided Caleb now sought his counsel, not because he was perfect, but because he had faced what they all tried to ignore: their own part in silence. And Dry Creek changed with him. It was slow, but it was real. The syndicate never came back. No officials, no miners, no claims. The land had spoken in a voice no paper could overwrite. One evening, months later, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and the first stars blinked awake, Caleb stood alone at the back of the saloon. He looked at the memory altar, at the flickering candles, and at the circle of chairs where the old chamber had once opened to the depths. He felt the wind move through the open door, warm and full. Then Nava joined him, setting down a carved stone on the altar, just a small one. "Protection," she said, "for what comes next." He smiled, not a wide smile, just enough. Margaret came in behind them, setting down a tray of coffee. "You ready for tomorrow?" she asked. Caleb nodded. "First community supper, first of many," she said, as laughter rose from the front room as music began to hum from someone's fiddle. As the air filled not with whispers but with stories and names spoken with love, Caleb stepped forward, took a breath, and let go of the man he once was. He wasn't alone anymore. He wasn't hiding. The past was still beneath him, always would be. But now, it had a home, and so did he.